y'all, and welcome to another video of My Creative Life with Kel Sweetie, where we read books, where we DIY, where we thrift, and essentially do whatever our creative hearts desire. Today, we are talking about books, but not just any books, but overhyped BookTok books. I read Babel and Fourth Wing. I think I might be in my fantasy era. So, if you want to find out more, keep watching. So, as I've talked about before in my reading wrap-up from last month, as well as getting into my TBR for this month of September, I have been in a reading slump. It has been bad. I've DNF'd 2 books. I finished 1 book just despite how many books I had DNF'd and ended up giving it 2 stars. Before I even got to the books that I DNF'd, I gave The Woman in the Window 3 stars or 2 stars, one of the two. It wasn't good. And it's just been bad. I've not been able to get out of it. It's been rough. Now, honestly, I've kind of been not reading as much because of the fact that I've just not been picking good books. They've just not been good or like living up to their hype, or their audiobooks are trash. I'm a part of Target Circle member club or whatever, which it's completely free. You should join immediately if you shop at Target because you get cash back, and they give out coupons like crazy on there. I say all of that to say Target already puts their books at 30% off of the market price on the cover. And I had gotten a coupon for 20% off of even that. So I got Fourth Wing and Babel for the hardcovers for the price of basically 1 hardcover. You know, reading books is not a cheap hobby. So I was like, why not? Let me read something completely out of my comfort zone. At this point, I'm already reading books that are just not meeting the mark. Let me read something completely different and maybe it'll be exactly what I'm looking for. And they delivered. I'm surprised that they delivered because I was one of the people who was hearing about Fourth Wing and was just like, oh my god, this overhyped BookTok book and everything. People read anything on BookTok. Who wants to read about dragons? Grown women are reading about these dragons left and right, loving this book. Rolling my eyes. It was amazing, and I'm gonna buy the second. I'm actually pre-ordering the second that's coming out this year. I know there are some people out there right now rolling their eyes at me, and they're just kind of like, Kelsey, the tropes, there's so many tropes. I know it is. And I know it's the whole, how many times can she say that Xaden's hot and whatever, but I loved the audiobook. I think it might have been the audiobook. The person who read it, she had voices for every different character and they sounded amazing. They sounded great. Somehow this novel is effortlessly queer, just in the representation of its different characters. Her best friend is, and it's talked about effortlessly. It's not just thrown in there just to kind of meet the mark. There's non-binary characters within it, and it meets the mark. They're not just thrown in there haphazardly. Xaden, while she kept on saying that Xaden was hot, Black Cat Soul. His Black Cat Soul definitely was something to behold. I personally thought that the spicy scenes in this book also were just the right amount of spice. I think that sometimes they're thrown into novels and it feels kind of like, oh, we just need to make this book more exciting. So let's throw this in here and let them say things that people never say or do. When, like, come on now. I didn't feel that with this one at all. I feel like those scenes were properly placed and talked about. And they weren't placed too early either. I think it was 50% through the book before anything like that happened. So there was a bit of a build. Just to give you a quick synopsis on the book, you're basically following a writer named Violet. She's a part of a society where essentially you're put into different territories, and one of those is the writer sector. Essentially, they're the soldiers, And they basically team up with dragons and use their magic to ride them and have these special powers that they channel through each other. Which, again, I'm sitting there and I'm like, this is a fantasy novel. I haven't read fantasy since I was in the 4th grade. Why would I like this novel? That is the basis. That is the background. Violet is going to the writer college to learn how to be a writer, and the things that end up happening are very much like normal college 20-something lifestyle. And that's where I think that the fantasy, while it's not, there's powers and people are riding dragons and people, you know, there's a lot of like consciousness and reading minds and stuff like that, it doesn't feel like that's what the exciting part is. Like, the exciting part for me reading the book was the plot of what she was going through and this love triangle situation she's in, and dealing with like these parental issues with her mother, which I thought that relationship was also interesting and complicated. Emotional unavailability of her mother that I feel like isn't written about enough in books. I love me an emotional unavailable woman in a book, especially a mother who is. It's just very interesting trope for me, and I couldn't put it down. I was finding reasons to read this book. I know that this is not like, you know, the new literature of like the year, you know. This isn't going to make history books, this book. And I actually looked up Rebecca Yarros' like prior works, and she has made this is her first fantasy. She was writing a lot of romance novels, which explains some of the romance and spicy portions of the book, why they were written the way they were written, because she had a lot of background in writing that. And it came across, if anything, I think that I would have maybe been like, what is this fantasy stuff? Or I should have been that way because that was so new for her. But at no point was I even like paying attention to that because of how well this, for me, it was written. I do feel like Violet as a character, by the end, got very interesting because she got some edge to her. Before that, I feel like she was a bit of a pushover, but not necessarily in a way that was like, oh, why did you write this person? Like, you know, sometimes you don't have to like every character that you read about. They just have to be interesting enough for you to keep reading. And I feel like her and her the dynamics between her and her friends, her and her love interests, her and her friend, like her best friend from back home, and him being this like very controlling, like daddy issues type situation. It was just very interesting to read. And by the time it got to the end, I will say, I was kind of sitting there like, where is this gonna go? It definitely was written like, oh, we already inked the contract for the second novel. And you can kind of tell where it switched gears and it ended that way. And with the surprise ending and twist, you could kind of see it. I don't think that, and I listened to the audiobook, but I think if I was just like purely just reading the physical copy, I would have maybe picked on it earlier. But the surprise twist at the end, while for me, I saw it and I was like, oh, okay, I'm gonna pick up a second book. It wasn't a, I can't believe that happened type of thing. So if anything, I'm kind of like annoyed at her and her reaction to some of the situations that happen near the end of the book in regards to her love interest and like the people she surrounded herself with. Like, I feel like she kind of has overreacted and she's not really being empathetic enough about like why certain things happened the way they did. But I love this book. That's wild for me to say. At 28, reimagining and refinding fantasy is a crazy thing for me. I don't have any fantasy books on my TBR for this month, but I think that this book definitely like I'm going to go at, if I'm hearing about a fantasy novel everyone's kind of losing their minds over, I may go at that differently. I may end up reading what's the one that everybody, A Court of Thorns? Is that what it's called? The one that has the gorgeous colorful colors that everybody's lost their mind about, and it's also fantasy spicy novels. I don't know. Another person that I know who has really gotten back into reading, Babel, here on YouTube, you should check her out. She's gotten into reading and she has some great reading book taste and everything. But she's reading that currently. I have to ask her how she's liking it. I don't know. Maybe I'm like, it's worth the hype and maybe I should read it now. crazy thought for me. We're gonna go into the second book that I also liked and was surprised of liking as well. And that's Babel. I can't believe I like Babel. I can't believe I read Babel. Keep in mind, I usually read books that are around the 300, 350 mark. 400 if I'm really like, oh, I have to read it, and it's like, that looks like a book that I have to read. Maybe. I can't remember last time I read a 400-page book. And both of these are like chunky. They're definitely chunk books. I remember seeing everybody read Babel and was like, only booktubers could read Babel. Nobody has time to read a novel this thick at all. It just looked completely unapproachable to me at 500 and something pages. It's an amazing book. It's an amazing book. Somehow, R.F. Kuang has sat here and done a literary fiction about forced immigration during the 1800s and used that as the catalyst of like talking about colorism, racism, misogyny, the nuances of those like two intersections of misogyny and racism, culture fetishization. Somehow she fit all of that into this book. We follow Robin Swift, who is originally from Canton and is taken from his country by a British man when his family comes down with the plague. He's saved and healed by these silver bars, which in this world are essentially magic, but they're powered by spells casted by the English word in translation. Which in this book they go into a lot. There's like, root words and, ancient dialects and Greek and Latin, and again, the audiobook, I really loved that there is someone who is reading the footnotes in the book and is saying all of the words that are in Cantonese in a very this is how you say it. Like, they have an audiobook reader and he's doing great, but you can tell that that's not his language, and they even have her follow up to say it more direct and proper. But he gets taken from his home, he goes to live with this Englishman, and he's taught translation to be like the super translator and to learn English as well as keep his Cantonese and learn Greek and Latin and root words of all kinds and stuff. And he does all this to get into Oxford. The reason why this Englishman does this is so that that London can receive more translators. And what they're doing is they're taking children from a very young age from their home countries that have languages that aren't necessarily spoken all over, so that they can turn them into translators for London and for them to work for them, essentially, because the English language does not work very well whatsoever on these silver bars, because the lesser spoken or a language is, the more valuable it is for these spells. Which, that is a whole metaphor for tactics of affirmative action and a conversation regarding that and everything, with this background always within this fantastical world that uses magic and silver bars, but talks about these very real social issues throughout. I don't feel like I can give you a full synopsis on what the book is about, because I feel like if you decide to read this book where things go off the rails, you need to be not expecting it, because when it goes off the rails, it's out of here. There's no turning back. I feel like once it hit that point, it just was really moving. Before that, I feel like Robin Swift as a character, me personally, I did not care for him. I felt like he really was dealing with model minority complexes that were so huge that I was frustrated with him at times. That's why some of his best friends that are in his group, I actually truly loved, because they were such a contrast to him. And by the time he kind of realizes the issue with the model minority complex that he had, it's where things are really starting to move and things have gotten off the rails for him to get that way. I really recommend it. I don't know if it's the way that it's been marketed or just how big it is or what, but I don't feel like I see enough people of color talking about this book, and it's marketed for us. It truly is such a great book. It talks about also white woman guilt in this book in a way that it's just so readable. And that leaves a lot of questions for me, seeing who is reviewing these books and how big it's gotten on BookTok. A lot of BookTok are white women. So to see these women really big up this book, I have to always ask the question of, and when it reached this part regarding you and your position, did it cause you to take a second to think? Because in a lot of these reviews that I've heard about this book, I've heard none of these reviewers speak on it whatsoever about this big turning point where the white woman in their friend group essentially does something that is just unforgivable. And even some of the conversations that happen around her, that it really is just a question of, and when you read it, did it hit? Did you understand what we were talking about? While I appreciated it, those parts weren't for me because I already recognized the intersectionality of that racism. So, that's of course the question that I have for this book and the people who are reviewing this book is, yes, it was a very great story. Did you understand what the story was telling you, though? Did you hear it and you say, wow, this is an amazing book? And did you read all of the metaphors and the conversations that it was supposed to be bringing up? Because that's the point of this book in the first place. I think that this really made me excited to read R.F. Kuang's Yellowface, which has been on my TBR for the longest. It's another book talking about racism in a institution and industry that actually talks about a white woman using her position to forward herself, especially at the expense of a minority person. I'm interested to hear and read that one, especially reading how the author wrote this one. I really like her writing style. Earlier, I talked about in my wrap-up video, I spoke about how Book Eaters was so literary that it lost the plot, that at the end of the day it was a thriller horror book. Whereas this was literary, but it didn't get so literary that you lost the plot of what this book was trying to achieve as a story. Big up to R.F. Kuang. This book was amazing. I'm so happy that they did the audiobook so well, because I will agree that I don't think, if I had to read this physically, I don't think that I would have gotten through it as quickly. Again, mainly nowadays, that's just because of time. If you don't have time, pick up the audiobook. The audiobook really is great for both of these books. The audiobook was amazing. So, yeah. Are they worth the hype? Fourth Wing and Babel were worth the hype. I'm picking up the second one of Fourth Wing, and I've pre-ordered it, and I'm excited what that's gonna bring. I'm excited to see where now, reading these fantasy novels and kind of getting out of my horror, thriller, sci-fi corner of the universe is gonna take me from here. With that being said, I have a ton of books on my TBR that I've already bought for spooky season that are in that genre, so don't expect that out the gate. But expect more books in the future, far along future, that are part of these genres, because I think that it really just changed my mind about really kind of separating myself from that. I think that I was just under the impression that I was just too old for those, or they just weren't enough for me. And I think now it's more of a conversation of, yeah, well, maybe you're just not reading the right books. So I'm super excited to see where this is going to take me now. These were both 2 5-star books. And hopefully it's completely gotten me out of my reading slump. And I'm excited to see kind of what other books that I read now that I've opened my mind. Let me know down in the comments what you thought of Fourth Wing and Babel. Did you like it? Did you hate them? Did my review kind of pique your interest on finally picking it up? I would love to know. I think that both of these books are kind of in a weird place. Either you love them or you absolutely hate them. And I think it's interesting to hear the conversation between the two people regarding these books and how they are. Also, if you liked this video, please subscribe for more book content. We do tons of book reviews here, as well as art and thrifting and other things. So please feel free to subscribe if you're really interested in that. I'm hoping to do some more book content coming soon, but until then, bye.